Welcome back to Star or Shovelware, my name's Luke, and in today's review we're going to be taking a look at Thunder Kid Hunt for the Robot Emperor on the Nintendo Switch, a 3D run and gun platformer which sees you blasting your way through an army of robotic lackeys, battling powerful bosses and attempting to stop the robot empire from expanding and taking over the world. Now this one has all the hallmarks of an early 90s classic, but is it actually any good and is it worth your cash? Well, hit that like button, subscribe for more Switch related content, and let's find out. So the story in this one is pretty much your typical 90s plotline, complete with a non-specific time period, with the game being set in the year 21X. In a world where the American continent has apparently already been ravaged by war, a rogue AI decides it wants a piece of the action, rises up against its creator, and leads an army of robots to conquer part of the country known as the Robot Empire. Luckily though, the US of A has been preparing for such a situation, and from a young age, Thunder Kid has been trained as an agent of justice, and so it's now down to him to single-handedly put a stop to the robotic invasion. Now aside from this intro, very little else is actually explained about the storyline, and while we do get a little bit of dialogue each time we meet one of the game's bosses, there are no cutscenes in the game, and all of the story elements are presented as lines of text, which are actually pretty hard to read against the dialogue box's background. As is often the case with retro-inspired games like this though, plot-wise things remain very thin throughout, and it's really just there to justify the game's setting, which admittedly is in keeping with games of the past, but it does sometimes just leave me wishing that developers would put at least a little effort into developing even just a simple storyline for their games. So gameplay with this one then, and when I first saw the trailer for it I was reminded of those third person viewpoint stages in the classic Contra games, which when it comes to modern retro games are something which have been very rarely explored. Thunder Kid attempts to recapture the feel of these moments though and builds an entire game from them, with you working your way through levels with a fixed camera angle so that you're always moving and shooting down range, and for the most part this works pretty well. However, it can be a bit of a pain when it comes to moving into adjoining corridors as you have no way of really seeing into them, and I frequently took hits from enemy projectiles which weren't yet on screen. Now the controls in the game are very simple, consisting of movement with a left thumbstick or D-pad allowing you to move backwards and forwards and strafe side to side, a jump button and a shoot button bound to both the Y button and the right trigger. And overall I'd have to say that the character movement feels alright, though Thunder Kid doesn't so much run as he does more of a bouncy little walk, and when it comes to the game's jumping, you can redirect your character's movement while in the air, which really helps for avoiding projectiles. In general, platforming in the game is pretty tight, though one real issue that I encountered was with gauging the distance of your jumps, as firstly the camera perspective makes this pretty difficult and so you really just have to try and use your character's shadow to gauge this, though it also doesn't help that taking hits from enemy shots knocks you back, and I actually lost count of the number of occasions when I successfully made a series of tricky jumps, only to get knocked off by an enemy projectile. Now level design in the game isn't too bad. Each stage usually has a couple of different routes through them, with the more difficult route usually being the one to reward you with a coin for your trouble, and for the most part I had no real issues working my way through them to the portal at their end point. There are often checkpoints before particularly tricky sections, meaning you're not having to start over should you lose all of your life, but I will say that further into the game it felt like particular enemy placements were there just to troll you, and the game does start to rely on excessive numbers of enemies in order to scale its difficulty. Enemy variety itself though is again not too bad. They fire a variety of projectiles and include things like shielded enemies who are able to block your projectiles, enemies which fire homing rockets and a couple which send out laser beams, but herein lies the game's biggest problem in my opinion, because the combat itself just really isn't that interesting. Beyond the odd larger enemy which forces you into a bit of a dance to avoid its attacks, none of the other enemies really present much of a challenge, and your own character's attacks consist of firing a single standard projectile, and unlike Contra, there aren't actually any power-ups in the game to spice things up a bit. This same issue carries over to the game's bosses, which again offer very little of interest and aren't particularly challenging once you learn to exploit the weaknesses, and again the difficulty with these bosses is primarily generated through the excessive use of projectiles. Now I understand that the game is kind of trying to blend 3D run and gun shooting with bullet hell mechanics, but there appears to have been very little thought actually put into making the fights interesting or giving them structure, as every single boss fight has a set of attacks which are used purely at random, so unlike most bullet hell games, there's not actually any skill involved which would usually come from having attack cycles to learn, and the difficulty of the bosses is generally just down to how good your RNG is. Now from start to finish it took me about an hour and a half to complete Thunder Kid, and this included grabbing the special coins in every single level, which actually turn out to be not so special as they don't appear to do anything at all. After collecting them all, I even went back and killed the end boss again in the hopes that I would then face off against a secret hidden boss or something, but alas I just got to witness the game's disappointing ending again, so collecting these coins appears to be a complete waste of time. Now, for the content on offer, I would have to say that Thunder Kid is a little overpriced. There's no real replayability with it, with there being no incentive, which could have maybe been added in the form of a leaderboard or the implementation of some sort of speedrunning timer, and there's only a single difficulty level, so no way to challenge you further. Generally, I have to say that I found the game just a little lackluster due to its dull combat and the fact that you're actually able to just run past most enemies, and I feel that had the game been around 20% faster, included more larger enemies which actually required some sort of strategy to defeat and maybe had a few power-ups thrown in for good measure, Thunder Kid could have actually been a solid little title, but as it is, sadly I feel the dev missed the mark a little with this one. So on the visual side of things, as soon as I saw the game I instantly recognised it as being from the same developer as Breakneck City, and I'm not gonna lie, I did go into this one expecting to be a little disappointed after my experience with that game. Graphically though, as with Breakneck, I do still really like the art style in this game. I think its pixelated textures and the low poly modelling really works to give the game that iconic 90s retro vibe, and as with Breakneck City, I enjoyed the vibrant colour palette in the game and its variety of environments. Audio wise, the sound effects are decent and add to its overall retro appeal, and when it comes to the game's soundtrack, I'd say that it's a definite improvement over Breakneck City's, with the music sounding a little more structured and a little less irritating. So when it comes to Thunder Kid's performance on the Switch, I'd definitely say it's an improvement over Breakneck City, which really struggled with its frame rate at times, and while on occasion I did experience a few minor frame rate dips with this one, for the most part it was pretty solid, even when there were a ton of on-screen projectiles. Issues wise, I've already spoke about most of them, with my two biggest issues being its precise jumping sections and lackluster combat, but in general, Thunder Kid just feels a little hollow and underbaked, like it's missing several key features. Don't get me wrong, it's not a terrible game by any means and it's still very much playable, but after an hour and a half's worth of gameplay I came away feeling disappointed and just wanting more. And so when it comes to my own personal rating, I'm going to be giving Thunder Kid Hunt for the Robot Emperor 2 out of 5 stars. If you're looking for something to dive into for an hour or so to give you that retro fix, which offers something a little different when compared to the usual retro affairs, then Thunder Kid may be worth your time. Just don't go in expecting too much from this one, and make sure to take its short runtime into consideration. And so that about does it for this review of Thunder Kid Hunt for the Robot Emperor on the Nintendo Switch. Hopefully it helped you out, and if it did, hit that like button, let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comment section below, and as always, if you've not yet subscribed to the channel then please consider doing so. For now though, I just want to thank you all once again for watching, and until next time, take care of yourselves and game on.